Am I audible?
Yes,
Awesome.
perfectly.
Thank you. I'm quite honored that Humam named the happy personality in this example after me, but I'm not very happy with how he set up this round because I think it's antithetical to the info slide. I'm going to start with a frame, and then I'm going to prove two things. Firstly, that this is a principal thing we still owe these people, regardless of downstream practical outcomes. And secondly, that the practical outcomes for everybody, including care providers, are far better on our side of the house. Let's start with the frame. The first thing I want to point out is that I think we have to buy the info slide at face value, and the info slide gives us everything we need to prove our case. Because quite crucially, the experience of feeling amnesia, that is to say, the inability to actually remember those previous experiences, is something that we think people are pretty cleanly able to adjudicate whether they have or not. And this is important because the main push out of OO about the difficulty in diagnosing these kinds of things is that this condition is somewhat fluid. I'm perfectly willing to concede this in abstract, but the important bottom line here is that we're going to prove in a second that we don't think people are likely to like self-identify into this kind of disorder. And so the only clash that really matters is whether or not doctors are able to sufficiently diagnose it. And I don't even think that really matters because the info site gives us that this is always associated with an experience of amnesia, and we think that is very easy to adjudicate. Think about how jarring it is when you experience memory loss, if you do at all. In fact, most people don't, which is why we think this is far easier to understand. The second thing I want to deal with out of the top from opening opposition is this idea that people are likely to self-identify in this. They'll think that their symptoms of whatever kind of mental health they have are actually DID. The first thing to say is that Humam himself tells us that these are very rare conditions, and that's very important because it affects the rate at which people are likely to self-select into the condition. That is to say that sure, once you are already doing the deep research because you're doing research into all these particular symptoms, that is the point at which our case activates, which means that the literature around it in that niche space is likely to talk about it in this way. And whatever sort of perceptions there are about the people that might meet this person, as well as any portrayals in media, are likely to do it this way. But let's not kid ourselves. This is still a very small part of the world in general. And for that reason, we think it's highly unlikely that the kind of activation point of their self-co-opting version of this is very likely. The last comment to make on that part of the argument is that there's just such massive stigma against this kind of disorder on either side of the house, precisely for many ideas for which Human flagged, which is that it is, maybe seen rightfully or wrongfully, and we'd say wrongfully just because the info side is God, that this is actually quite wrong. And for that reason, because the stigma is so strong, it is precisely unlikely that people identify into this. At the end of my speech, I will do some weighing why, even if you think Humam's conception of the debate, which is we should ignore parts of the info slide and just debate this as the actual medical debate, even if that is the correct conception of the round, we'll weigh out why we should err on the side of caution and our benefits are more important. Let's move on to practical substantives then. The first thing I want to talk about is having relationships with people and the kind of social experience that opening opposition talks about and that COSAR also mentions. And I want to start with their case here, and then I'll move on to our contributions. The thing that Humam says is, for some reason, it's very difficult to have to be friends with multiple people. But I'm friends with multiple people. Like, guys, I hate to say this trivially, but obviously, I think it's great if you can actually finally understand your friend in a far better way instead of assuming that Jalila also is Mick or Daniel also is Patrick. I think it's far easier to manage your relationships than assuming these are all the same people. The second thing they say is you're probably not going to be going on dates with multiple versions of your personality. Like polygamy is on the rise. I don't know, like open relationships, da 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 da, cross apply, whatever. But here's the more salient response to opening opposition. The main crux of the actual difficulty they identify is just that the person isn't able to tell you who they are or maybe when they're going to be you. We can test both of these things. First of all, you very much are able to tell whoever you're interacting with which person you are. I know I'm Liam right now. I know I'm not Kosar right now. But secondly, in terms of prediction, the info site correctly identifies that it is particular emotions which are most likely to bring out those types of personalities, which means that if you know that you are about to go through a very intense experience because you're about to meet your family who might have abused you as a child, you can probably warn your partner about the extent to which you're going to be experiencing life as one of these personalities. None of these pan out on opening opposition. What do we tell you about why the counterfactual on their side of the house is far worse in a bit, Jalila? Because we explain to you that conflating multiple people with such distinct experiences as one person is likely to lead to so much of the worst stigma that they try to depict. It's on opposition side of the house where I do assume that I'm going on a date with the same person that I am more disappointed when they change. And here's some new mechanism to extend the scalar of this impact, which is I think that in the status quo, there is a great degree of normalization that one non-DID person can have very, very different personalities. So, for example, we're all caught up in terms like, sometimes I'm an extroverted, sometimes I'm introverted. We think, sometimes I experience my life with this INTP. Sometimes my moon rising sign is actually what's determining me versus like my sun sign, if you're like an astrology person. All throughout popular culture, we have these quite pervasive norms, which seem to say that people can be slightly different. But this is quite bad because people with DID experience their lives in markedly different ways than that normalization. So because the opening opposition feeds into this narrative that you should be able to expect things that the same that you would with any non-DID friend, because we all are kind of different and quirky at times. This is terrible because you have higher expectations. You expect that they are going to feel the same way. They expect that they are going to have the same memories. They expect that you will want to do the same things with these person when you're in different states, and that's patently terrible. The last thing I want to talk about then, actually, before I go on, I'll take a POI from closing.
So the issue with this is that it's simply not true that normal people also have all the same memories all the time. Like when I'm in a debate, I have an easier time remembering previous debates that I've experienced, but I can't access those memories when I'm chilling with my family on the beach.
Okay, but there's a huge difference here, which is you can access those memories. If I try to think about what my last debate round was like, I can access that at any time because I'm a person who does not have the ID. Look, panel, no matter how much CO or OO tries to muddy the waters here, the info side gives us that you're experiencing amnesia. This is a massive delta, and it's not comparable to anything else they talk about. The last thing I will talk about then is on continuity of care and why we get better medical care for these people on our side of the house. The problem with the opening opposition case is that it's exactly the fact that you are treating this as one legal person that leads to far worse care outcomes for these people. And here's why. It is far more difficult to it is far easier on our side of the house under a guardianship model to establish power of attorney where the main is the one who has the main relationship with the physician, whereas all the alters are just under that power of attorney. On opposition side of the house, if you treat this as the same person and the same person is saying that they want to be released from care, when that actually might not be good for the main or the rest of the personalities, this is far, far harder to deal with as a medical system because it's the same person who is being demanded to be released. It is the fact that we have a standard care relationship that leads to far better experiences. I am not the same person as any alter I have because I don't have their memories. That distinction, it means that everyone will be treated far better on our side of the house. We have far more productive care. We're very proud to propose.
Thank you very much. Now on to the member. I've got here. Sorry. Yeah. The yellow. Right.
Okay. Can everyone hear me? Okay.
Yes, we can hear you. Yeah.
Opening government treats amnesia as the one defining characteristic of this. I think the issue here then is like, unfortunately, this is simply not an objective metric, as Humam has already told you, right? Like, I can tell you I experience amnesia without you having any ability to verify whether that is actually true, because it is my subjective experience at the end of the day. So no physician can actually tell me, oh no, you don't have DND because you didn't actually experience this amnesia. I think this muddied water is still very much existent. The speech is then going to be very simple. I'm going to first take down the opening government's case and then tell you Humam's case and why we should ultimately take this big. Let's look at what opening government tells us then. Opening government first says, like, this is going to be like a situation in which a main is given control and everyone else is treated like dependents. Think about a couple of issues with this, right? Because let's say one of your personalities, quote unquote, commits a crime. What are you going to do? What type of liability are you going to put this person to, right? Normally the default is that we put this individual into prison. But then if another alter ego comes up, do you then release this individual from prison because they weren't the one directly responsible for this type of action, right? Like, I think it's unfortunately very unclear. Like, you don't even know when, no, thank you, that like the criminal personality is going to come back and then you should jail them again. But like, I think in practice, this is just extremely difficult if they truly want to give like the separate legal personhood idea, right? Because even under the idea of like a guardian for another adult, like you don't put a guardian in prison for the actions of their dependents, right? So unfortunately, like I just don't know how they're going to be able to work with legal accountability here. But let's talk about this principle about like to treat people distinctly, right? Because these people ultimately have like different values, different preferences. Maybe like they can feel emotions because that's okay because we all feel the emotions of our friends. I think fundamentally the fact that there is no external like understanding of this type of different personality is just like going to be extremely harmful. For example, sure, we experience things differently, but our bodies, our internal organs processes the things that we experience and ultimately derives meaning from it. No matter what they try to say about people having experiences differently, you still fundamentally live in the same body, have the same set of organs that does all of the processing for you, right? Like I think Huang explained this a little bit better because he's in med school. Okay, but ultimately, the idea that memory makes you who you are is also something we want to contend with. Because I would posit that a lot of other circumstances, people have experienced memory loss. Like people have other diseases like Alzheimer's where you experience memory loss. You wouldn't categorize that to be an entirely different person if they can't recall certain events. But also like daily people, like I forget things that happened like 2 years ago or like things that happened last week. Does that make me a fundamentally different person? I don't know if it does, right? So I'm going to push back on this idea that punishment is what makes you fundamentally distinct. But lastly, I want to talk about the idea of like responsibility sharing on a day-to-day basis because even if they are different personalities, they fundamentally still have the same responsibilities because they live in the same body. This is like all of the day-to-day tasks, right? If one of the alter ego has a pet, for example, right? The other alter egos, when they come up, still have to have the obligation to care for these pets. So there's a fundamental level of responsibility sharing that you cannot witness in other type of separate entities on a day-to-day basis. But lastly, like I think like this is a massive way to evade responsibility, right? Government posits like, look, people are not going to opt into this because there's a huge social stigma around it. I would like to first review, like, I don't know, people kind of pretend to have illnesses all the time for attention. Unfortunately, this is something that does exist on a social level. But to like, this offers such an easy way out for people to escape responsibility, right? Like, if I'm just going to be like, oh, I messed up, I lashed out at a friend. Oh, what if that was a different personality? I was just extremely angered, and that's what activated a different personality. Because then I no longer, as an individual, have to deal with the consequences of my actions. So I think there's a pretty clear incentive here as to why people would potentially opt into this to try and evade responsibility, given that you're the individual, by the way, that has ultimate control of like which alter ego you're in, right? Like you can tell people, hey, like this is my main, but sometimes this alter ego gets triggered. Like since this is so individualized, as Humam already mechanized you, people are able to utilize this in ways that like they choose to. But then they then talk about this idea about how like this is going to be better for social interactions and tries to flip our arguments because now people have like because in the counterfactual people have expectations of the same person and that is really harmful. First of all, I just don't think it is true in the status quo, right? Like when you know someone who has D&D, you understand that when you meet this person, sure, they have a main personality, but they have other personalities that could potentially come out. And you just understand, like maybe the relationship I'm building is with one person or is with like the main personality specifically. No, thank you. So like I just don't think that this is fundamentally the expectation that people put on you, given that they understand the nature of the type of disease you have. But like also, like I think what moms tells you is really important because for a continuity of relationship to continue, you have to continuously interact with the same person, right? So like unfortunately, if you recognize people as different individuals, it's fundamentally really hard for people to conceptualize a person with the same face but multiple distinctive personalities. I think this is something that's quite unintuitive to people, and people are scared or have a misunderstanding. Sure.
Okay, I have a twin, or maybe if I did, I don't think people struggle with that. But the more salient thing here is that it is far, far worse on your side of the house because you tell people that it is the same person. So those expectations you're trying to frame out, that's exactly what your side of the house looks like. Because you say it's one person.
Yeah, so we say that it's one person with fluctuating personalities, but that I think that allows people to buy into beginning a relationship with you far more likely, right? Because people don't think, oh, I'm dealing with 8 personalities rather than one person. I have no idea like which person or like maybe I do know which person I'm connecting with. I don't know whenever that personality is going to come back. Like I think all of these are extremely unintuitive and why I wouldn't just choose to opt into making relationships with someone else. I think they're very hand wavy about the like second argument that mom gives you, but I think this one is quite important, right? right? Because oftentimes D&D, as the way it plays out in the Satirical Scroll, oftentimes comes with a lot of other types of mental illnesses as well. They come often with anxiety, depression, oftentimes stemming from childhood trauma, which means this individual probably needs some level of medical care. And we think it's very difficult to engage with multiple people insofar as, like, again, as he plans out, you cannot have like separate treatment plans for each individual since they're all in the very same body. And you cannot prescribe one medication and expect this person to take it in regular intervals because then now that it switches into multiple personalities. So all of these medical treatments that you're going to be giving this person is going to be largely it's going to be very, very difficult, and then you need consent of every single individual. If they want to say, look, the legal guardian or the guardian that gets all of the control, I think that doesn't then fundamentally meet their own burden of trying to recognize these people as like individual personalities, right? If you're saying that one person has control and they can dictate, for example, the medication that other individuals are taking, I think you're fundamentally still falling to the trap to recognize that they're one single person at the end of the day. On this basis, very, very proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. Before going on,
the radicalness of the world that government supports in this debate is that it fundamentally breaks the Western ontologies that has strongly proliferated in terms of how people conceive of the relationship between the consciousness and the body. That is, because of the rise of Western liberal thought during the Enlightenment, there's a clear concept that there's an innate connection between one individual conscious and the body in which they reside in, and the fact that they are materially interacting in a way that is causal and that is entirely determinative of who they are. This world is one that is retroactive. That is, it's one in which we're conceiving of this completely differently, and we have a different conception of what types of ontologies can be. That is, it's a world in which you have one body and multiple minds that reside within it. We're going to do a lot of things on closing government because ultimately the debate in the front half boils down to OG saying it's philosophically preferable to do this and opening opposition saying it's clinically problematic to do this. But instead, we're going to offer an actual clear conception of what the comparative of two worlds look like and show why it is absolutely preferable to reside in the one in which you recognize these different things. So I'm going to have 4 points of extension. First is about how it is that this resolved difficulties of navigating the world for these individuals with clear implicit clash with opening opposition. Second, I'm going to talk about the intrinsic value of the alters and why it is that we should care about them and their experiences in a way that is fundamentally different from the clinicalized negative sense that opening opposition is talking about. Third is going to be about conceiving of different ontologies and why it is that this is likely to have trickle-down effects for all the other multiple types of other beings. So for instance, people who are two-spirited in the context of Indigenous communities in Canada or trans individuals, and why it is that it's likely that society with this retrospectiveness are going to be at least more responsive. And fourth, I'm going to talk about the responsibility for actions, which I think is going to extend on the legal material that exists in opening government, but in a much more deep way. So first on difficulty of navigating the world. Essentially what a shift in these norms look like is it means that there's going to be a much better map for navigating social relationships that makes it much easier for people to engage with these individuals. Note that on other side of the house, these people are going to live very difficult lives. I don't necessarily buy what opening opposition says, that it's like they're essentially implying that this is fake. And I think OG is right that we ultimately need to opt into this conception of the debate where there's like much more clear arguments, like I think what CO is getting at with their POIs. But I think what matters is how it is that these individuals are best able to navigate reality and be able to live the best life. The problem that these individuals face right now is when you have an extreme version of this, is which the info side's talking about, not the edge cases that OO is talking about that are difficult to diagnose, but people who don't experience severe continuity between their individualness, in which when you switch out and alters, you're dropped into new situations that are oftentimes fearful, you don't know the people around you, and you don't know how to interact with them. This is a very, very difficult experience for anybody to live in. So first, you're likely to end up in situations that you didn't priorly conceive that you were going to be in. That is, for instance, if I had an alter and I subbed into this debate round right now, and all of you were looking at me to give a speech, that would probably be very scary. But there's much more extreme versions of that. So for instance, you're driving on the road or you're in a very serious situation, because oftentimes things like stress are things that trigger switches between alters, such that you're going to end up in situations that are radically difficult. The problem then is that there's currently no clear map for people to be engaged in this in a positive way. In the opposition world, in which it's one person and different personalities and just how they're shifting and how they interact the world, and people don't conceive of you as radically different, they're not going to approach you in the same way in which they treat you with the type of care and respect that you deserve in these situations. That is, they're going to recognize that you're a different person, that you need to have care in these situations, that you need to be able to deal with the fact that these individuals are in these radically scary situations that they need to be resolved and need to be benefited in that way. But no. But this is just like in terms of that specific situation. I have 4 sub ideas here. So first is spiritual. That is the fact of how it is that you're able to conceive of yourself as a person. Because the point where you experience this radical amnesia and you have no contingency with that other type of being, it's going to be very difficult for you to be able to form any type of personality that actually matters, such that you can pursue your interests and be able
Wait,
to.
sorry, pause. I can't hear anything.
Can we pause the timer? So I have 340. Can you hear me?
Can we, like, is it muted?
No, it's not.
Can the other judges hear?
Yeah, we can hear. I think Matt's just frozen.
Okay, can you chat them and let them know?
Yeah.
The other panel said they can hear, so.
Oh my God. You say, oh my God, seed debate. There's a throwback.
Because I think it's muted.
Oh, it based.
Okay, are we good now?
Wait, never go.
No,
No,
they
you're
ain't
not.
coming back.
Okay, he'll be coming back.
Oh, wait a little bit.
Is this all switch?
Can you hear me now?
Is he like,
They just rejoined the video.
okay.
Yeah. That's just.
Can you hear me?
Hi, so sorry about that. My Wi-Fi crashed. You might need to go back to the middle of your speech.
Yeah, we paused when you.
Yeah, I paused. I paused at 340 because you had the tech issue.
Okay, yeah, great.
Okay, is everybody ready now? You know what I was talking about, the spiritualness and developing identity. Okay. Yes. So it's about being able to conceive of yourself and an identity and relationships with other people. That is, if you're just seen as something that like exists as, you know, something that's just a different personality that doesn't have these modes of being, it's much more difficult for you to be able to do things like develop your own friends and be able to have your own type of life, right? Because note the info slide that these people don't only have different experiences, but they can have different types of wants and needs in pursuit of the good and different things that they want to be able to access happiness. It becomes much harder to do that when reality tells you that you're not real and you don't exist. But the second element of this is economic in terms of being able to provide opportunities for these people. In status quo, when it's conceived of somebody who has different personalities and the fact that they don't have continuity of those experiences, it's going to be very difficult for these people to be able to do things like succeed on the job market if it's going to be this seems person as a risk in which they're going to be pushed out because like, well, you might just have something going on in which you don't have the ability to access that training anymore, or this ultra might end up an experience where they have to do their job and they don't know what's going on and they don't have the ability to access that training. The comparative then is that society develops in a different way in which it is able to engage and value these people and recognize that that is something that goes on. In the same way we look at other recognized handicaps and the massive amount of benefits within the disability community to be able to do things, such as pushing for things, the fact that people with certain disabilities, like people who live in a wheelchair, need to have different support mechanisms that exist in society, such that this is the type of map for navigating social situations that now emerges, because now there's going to be a map for society to be able to respond and support these people such that they can now engage in those types of opportunities. But the third is interpersonal, not just in terms of your friends so you can develop a personality that way, but so that you have the ability to do things like have relationships with your family, such that they can do things like recognize the fact that they might have 2 or 3 or 4 children within the same body and ontology, rather than having one in which is engaging in things that are oftentimes seen as negative. This is what's so actually important, and it's bizarre that opening government didn't point out, is that it's about also, like they say the word stigma, but they don't conceive of what in the alternative people actually conceive of these of. That is, the media is not what they're saying in terms of conceiving it as just somebody who's engaging in this sort of thing. So oftentimes there's explicitly negative conceptions of these individuals, throwing out things like the fact that they're insane, or they're not people that you want to engage in, or they're dangerous, or they're a threat, such that you never want to form relationships with them. The comparative then is that you're much more likely to, once people have the social understanding, to recognize and engage with these things. Yeah.
Would you rather have, let one person live a default life for 40 years, or one person with gender dysphoria lives for 20 years and one person without it lives for 20 years?
I think the problem is that on either side of the house, these people are living and they exist, as opening government tells you. The fact is you're making them suffer, and you're making the main personality is not getting the benefits of living that fulfilling life we talk about, because they're still going to be switched out and they're going to have to deal with the suffering that the alter face. The physical trauma of the body that emerges when you experience those sorts of things are very negative and has that bad effect. All of this stuff of the first extension coalesces to just people's happiness and not engaging in things like self-harm. Because when society rejects you because they don't have a social map to engage in these sorts of things, you turn to things like alcohol or drug abuse, you engage in self-harm, and you live a very negative life. This is what flows into the second. That is the intrinsic value of the alter. I already told you all the benefits that are better when they're conceived of distinct personalities, but it's the fact that we should weigh in the debate that these are people that matter, that we should care about, who experience suffering in the same way that any other person does, and we don't want to continue to push them in more suffering in the way that opening opposition does. But in conceiving of different ontologies, it's about the fact that we can break the mode of thinking that opening opposition asserts, that there's limited conceptions of who people can be, and instead we need to clinically look at this and diagnose these people. Instead, what happens, at which we break this retrospectively, people are going to conceive of this as radically different, such that you can have alternate tones of being in terms of alternate lives. This not only has benefits to these individuals, but has spillover effects in terms of how people conceive of different things. So note that on scope of impact, it's not just that we get these benefits in terms of people who live this particular different ontology, but it's all the different types of walks in life that are different from you and me, such that they can benefit and have these social maps. Proud to propose. All right.
Okay. I'm going to get started. I don't have DID, but I do have other mental issues and whatnot, right? So sometimes I do come into a debate room and I break down crying. This happened to me at Hart House a couple of years ago. Do you think everyone was sitting around like, oh, that's kind of awkward, that's kind of weird? No, right? The CG case of like everyone will be so ridiculously, brutally mean to these people with DID and people will have no idea how to ever interact with them ever. It's just not true. I'm going to explain why this leads to less therapeutic treatment of DID, i.e. less integration of alters. This is going to be a vertical extension off of opening opposition in a couple ways. First, I don't think opening opposition proves sufficiently that integration is something that is desirable, and especially if the government bench claims are true, that these are morally relevant people with separate interests, then it's kind of unclear that that's a sufficient burden to overcome. And second, they don't give you enough of the correct context on DID. So let's explain why this prevents integration, leads to worse DID suffering. Currently, most people with DID receive treatment. That is, most people with DID go to talk therapy where they confront their trauma and resurface their old memories, where they collect the different preferences and beliefs and experiences of their different alters, and they usually have medication like antipsychotics, etc. But the crucial thing is that this is a treatment path that currently exists, that the medical establishment currently endorses, that we currently have supply chains and training, etc., for people to carry out. And it works with a reasonably high success rate. It doesn't work perfectly for every person with DID, but for most people with DID, it does reduce the frequency. It helps them manage splitting into different alters. Usually it does help integrate some alters, even if it doesn't succeed with all of them all of the time and whatnot. Why does this conception prevent integration from happening for anyone, even those who currently want it and currently benefit from it, etc.? Three main reasons. First is it's greatly stigmatized. You're seen as erasing an entire individual if indeed we do legally and socially treat these people as entirely different individuals. And so when you go to your family or your friends or whatever, and you're like, hey, I'm thinking of trying to get these alters integrated into my personality, they react more with shock and horror, etc. Second, importantly, individuals' alters choices, yes, must be respected. What this means is that you only need one alter who decides that they don't want to consent. One alter who may not even be individual. One alter who may be a memory of trauma manifested in your body, taking over your experiences and your functions, etc. If you have one person not consent to this treatment, then everyone else in that body suffers because they can't move on. Third, and importantly, when multiple identities are seen as legitimate and valid, you lose all financial support for these people to pursue these kinds of treatment. That is, insurance companies no longer cover treatments that seek to integrate alters into one person, because this is seen as something, beyond just being vaguely stigmatized, that's unnecessary, because we just see this as a happy, fun, different mode of living. So now, and importantly, why is integration so desirable? Opening opposition is like, friendships are kind of tough, and that is basically the main extent of their analysis, other than that, and Trust me, bro. So here's the first really important reason it's desirable, is the ability to work and study and to build a career and an education over a long term. You cannot make long-term decisions about what to do with your life when you have different conflicting preferences flicking back and forth within you. One person who wants to be a doctor and one person who wants to, like, I don't know, be unemployed and play video games all day or stuff like that. So in the long term, you cannot chart a study path. You cannot enroll in university. You cannot go to a job interview because you're not sure it's one that you're going to be able to carry out. Second, and importantly, on the short term, it is difficult to learn and to work, etc. Sure, maybe we accept you can keep some muscle memory, but you're not going to be able to keep all your coworkers straight if you literally have different people who have different memories of which of them they've experienced with. Like, and government bench can say all they want, but like, oh, we're giving these people a map with how to deal with it and stuff, right? But it doesn't erase the difficulties. It doesn't erase the fact that your boss sighs when you ask to be introduced for a third time to a client you've already met twice. It doesn't erase the fact that people glance at you a little bit like afraid, unsure if your alter who is more aggressive is initially here or not. I don't think that finally the fact that like this kind of removes such an ability to pursue and build long-term knowledge and to pursue and build long-term careers, etc., probably inflicts a lot of shame on people, even if there isn't social stigma. I.e., like, even when I had mental issues and my grades dropped or whatever, there was no social stigma in my extremely woke environment. Everyone was like, that's okay, be yourself. It's okay, like, go get treatment and whatnot. But it doesn't erase the shame that you cannot do things that other people around you can do. You do not have that capability, and you don't have that option, that fulfillment open to you to pursue a career or an education that you enjoy, that everyone else around you enjoys. So even if we believe everything government says, and there is less stigma, a little less stigma against DID, it doesn't change the fact that without integration, people can't do things, and they feel sad and they feel shameful about this. Secondly, and importantly, there are traumatic aspects of alters, and it can be really useful to have these things integrated. This will clash with CG, and also kind of OG, who they're like derivative of or reliant on in some places. So here's the issue, right? Like, government bench is assuming these are all independent people who all kind of independently have different preferences across functions that they do. Like, they're all human beings who wake up and eat breakfast and they have things they like to read and they have work they like to go to. But with DID, this is not the case. DID is formed through trauma. Like, this is within the diagnostic criteria, right? What this means is that you have some alters who exist purely or who come out purely when you are in traumatic moments, when you need to protect yourself. And these alters may be more like more prone to be violent than other alters, right? You have some alters who are forced to bear the memories or to bear the functions, maybe the unpleasant functions that you had to carry out when you were younger, etc. And when these alters exist, it is suffering for them because they don't get to experience the good things or the good functions. And when they don't exist, people have incomplete understandings of themselves, and that is bad. We don't think it is an ontological harm to integrate these alters into one person because the different aspects of them still exist. It's not that they're completely, oh, sorry, I'll take a POI.
Okay, so this whole case rests on the probability that integration is likely. This is highly, highly speculative. On weighing, I think on risk, it's better to treat these as separate people.
Right. You're telling me my many reasons about why the entire medical establishment pushes you to this prudent treatment method that is currently funded by insurance for a lot of people is just highly speculative. Look, I'm not saying it works for everyone, but it's not speculative at all that it's a treatment that exists in the status quo and it works for a lot of people. So I think that it is not equivalent to killing people to integrate alters who have trauma and who participate in different functions or who hold different memories. I think rather it is an aspect that improves all of these existences if we do accept they are separate existences, because A, now they distribute both the positive and negative functions and the positive and negative memories that they're experiencing, but B, now you have an individual who can achieve so much more total fulfillment because they can go to university, because they can get a job, because they can get friends who are going to remember their coffee order or remember the things that they did in school, etc., that they otherwise would not have. CG is like, oh, this expands ontology and stuff. The problem is, like, we're expanding understandings of the self on either side of the house. I don't know why we need to add this. We have like transgender activists doing amazing work, regardless of whether or not this is added. I'm not sure what tangible benefit this adds for us. I think on either side, people are kind of nice to these people we oppose.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Amazing. Okay, thank you. Here. Thank you very much. Now I recognize the gov whip here.
I know this will be looking. Already.
Be starting in 3, 2. Enough with this clinical poof, right? Like, we need to deal with emotion as it exists and what are the proximate logical reasons as to why we should treat this condition in the way that it should. I'm going to provide some thorough refutation for opposition and explain why we're winning this debate. So I want to first start with opening opposition. They say, and this was not responded to by opening government, that you get more DID because you lean into the different identities. I have several responses. The first thing is that this is a misattribution. That is the reason why people experience DID is completely independent of what other external forces say. It is an experience of distinctive symptoms, like, for example, happening at random, or for example, happening because of trauma. Just because you say this person is a person doesn't mean that it controls whether they engage or choose to engage in this kind of action, because it is independent of the situation. Secondly, there's no reason why the main person or anyone wants to lose control. Nobody in this situation wants to be in this kind of situation. So it's not clear why this would be reinforced in any kind of capacity. But thirdly, and I want to do the most important flip here that's going to justify why I specifically think closing oppositions out of this debate. This is the flip. Unlike other conditions that you have, you need the compliance of these other individuals that act functionally like a different person as per the emotion, right? So otherwise, if you don't get this, you get things like self-harm. You get lack of compliance in terms of taking the medication that they themselves seek that they want these individuals to take. And this is exactly where Pat's extension kicks ass. Because the thing is that the psychological reality here is different. There's different preferences. There's this different spiritual imbuement. There's this different relationship. There's a different person. Now, imagine this. You are a person, but people are telling you you're not a different person. Imagine being treated poorly as a result of this, and poorly doesn't necessarily mean negatively. Poorly just means not acknowledging your existential existence. Imagine how you react. You react pretty hostile. Imagine if you were told that people were trying to erase you. You'd act pretty hostile. So to that extent, the problem that happens is that if you try to suppress this non-identity, which I think is the end conclusion of their side of the house, when you treat it as a different personality, because you treat it as a problem, you treat it as this personality that is different, that needs to be fixed, that takes over and control, not this other individual that you have to negotiate with, that you have to find a way to live in this body with, then the fundamental reality is that you're more likely to have internal conflict, you're more likely to have sabotage as a result, you're more likely to shut down, and you're more likely to have this negative treatment. And Pat makes a very good philosophical argument here that this person's existence is going to be existentially suffering. That when you go in this other personality and that you don't have friends, that you're not acknowledged related, that people treat you differently, that people like basically put you in a straitjacket because like, oh, you're just in a different personality right now, that means that you are going to suffer. This person is suffering for no existence. So I'm going to go back to opening opposition, but I first want to explain why closing opposition and then is out of this debate. They say that firstly, you're likely to have no integration. Their whole thing is assertive. There is nowhere in this debate or structural mechanisms provide why this kind of therapy works for this kind of thing. I'm unclear why specifically taking antipsychotics or telling somebody's work. But actually, I'm going to do something we're supposed to do debate, structural reasons. Here's why their clinical thing is unlikely to work and does not work in status quo. The reason why is because they say needing consent is a bad thing. I think firstly, on our side of the house, we have things like medical frameworks for intervention, even when people are not always able to consent. So I think you're able to get them complied. But this is the fundamental game theory. Take all the analysis I just talked about and Pat's analysis. One, if you do not get treated well, then you are likely to disagree and there's no chance therapy works. You are not going to be compliant. You're not going to share voluntarily information that they seek to share in these kinds of therapeutic sessions in order to create that kind of integration. They are more likely to get on our side of the house when you actually make them work with you and it's not as destabilizing, that you create this alternative identity, this person that you then engage with constructively, and you talk about what is the best way. And then secondly then, even if you do treat them well, they experience the hardship of being dropped out in different scenarios, right? So the thing is that even in our side of the house, when you do treat them as a different person, these people still have hard lives. Like it's hard, as Pat said, to be dropped into an alternative situation that you have no experience with, which means that there's an inherent incentive for all personalities, all peoples in this situation to try to comply, to negotiate in order to create a solution, because it's a game theory situation. Their lives all actively get worse when they don't comply and work together, but when they work together, they're able to actually move towards a solution. And maybe that solution is actually getting integration, which means our best case scenario is this. Either one, integration is not possible anyways because people want to stay by themselves, but that means that at least you're able to create a working framework for real life where you engage with each other and therefore able to have a stable, systematic life. Or on the alternative, these people comply and want to integrate because they realize they don't want to live a fraction of an existence and want to engage. On their side of the house, the worst case scenario is you do not comply and it destabilizes things to absolute fucking shit. This person does not trust you. They do not trust the medical officers. They don't take the meds, and they certainly do not share voluntary information. This is why their case like absolutely falls out of the debate. And they said, but still, they might see the treatments unnecessary. No, because the life is still hard for all the reasons that we still provided. So then, I want to now continue on to closing opposition. They said it's more difficult to engage in relationships. 3 responses. Firstly, you're probably much more confused when there's a set of shifts in behaviors that are unexplainable. Secondly, people interpret personality differences the way they do themselves, right? So the conception of personality differences, notably, this notion is not like, for example, being plastered on every fucking wall, right? Like, I didn't even know what DID that much was before this. I'm probably snocking after this notion. I know what personality is to me. Personality is like my alter ego. Like, I'm like with my girl. I'm like, I'm being like all cutesy. Oh, I'm with my friend. Like, I'm being like a bro, right? I'm not going to be able to conceptualize this difference that exists in terms of personality when this person's acting like a fundamentally different person. When they're crying there, for example, they're like acting like a complete bro in a way that like is not even conceptualized in this kind of situation, right? So the problem is that this narrative does not overpower that. People are fundamentally confused when they react with you. But when you treat them and the internet says, this is how these people act, these are fundamentally different people, you're able to conceptualize and compartmentalize that with how you understand behavior much more, which means you're able to assign a different relationship, which is exactly what Pat explained in his case. Yes.
People can be extremely depressed due to incorrect evaluations of themselves and their self-worth.
No.
You don't need to accept that evaluation to treat them or to treat them kindly and with
No. You do need you literally do need their compliance. You want to send them psych ward and put them in a straitjacket? Like, I don't understand what the alternative here is. They don't have those same positive experiences because of the fact that they are in these kinds of situations. I'm genuinely unclear as to how this sufficiently responses to my case. Secondly, then they say there's continuity of care. It's firstly probably not that. Okay, actually, in this bit, is it that bad if you actually try to get their consent, like I just suppose that you do? Like, is it really that bad if that increases the standard of care? I'm actually not sure it's that bad. But secondly, these people may not take the drugs otherwise to treat different steps. Okay, the criminal responsibility case doesn't matter because, like, first of all, mens rea probably does not get established in this situation anyways. So it means that they're likely to go into, like, I don't know, psychiatric care or something else. And lastly, the DID is not real. It's self-diagnosed thing. 1, there's at least some back in existence. 2, just because we don't fully understand the brain does not mean that DID does not exist. And 3, because it's rare, it's unlikely that you'll self-identify rather than medical practitioners identify it. Like, that's what they already said. Okay, why did we win? We clearly won over opening government because we gave you the most obvious arguments around. It's about self-harm and non-compliance and the standard of care getting worse and people not being able to engage with you. To the extent that I don't give a fuck how real this is, based on what the motion says, this meaningfully makes these people's lives better. Lives, people's, not just one. We are so proud to.
Can you hear me? Cool. Sorry about mine. Cool. Thank you very much for that. And now to finish the opposition whip here.
I'm going to spend most of this speech replying directly to CG. However, I think this will, and I'll try to flag where, implicitly engage with the contributions of other teams, because a lot of this clash are surrounding what is a better way to understand care and what is a way to understand identity flows throughout the benches. So let's start with what we heard from Daniel. So, well, one thing that actually I want to flag at the top that wasn't engaged with from Jalila's speech is that no one in this round, until Jalila comes up, acknowledges the fact that DID is a product of trauma in the vast majority of cases. This is an empirical claim. You can look it up. The reality is that people in the bulk of DID cases develop their alters as a way to process a traumatic experience that they went through, often as a child, which is why a lot of alters also involve things like age regression. This gets to a lot of very serious issues with having them be separate people, which we'll talk about later. And Jalila explained some in her speech, what if you decide that you want to go to grad school, but you have a child within you who is incapable of living independently outside of your parents' house, for example. So, okay, I do want to explain, though, that there's stuff about trans people. Let me just get this out of the way. I saw it coming a mile away and it came like a truck. Okay, so trans people are often misdiagnosed with DID because transgender identity involves contextual trauma that comes from having to suppress your own identity as
a trans man or a trans woman, for example, and not being accepted in society. So oftentimes that creates a source of trauma that then leads to a person having an alter of a different gender and then later on transitioning. So the correct path of care in those cases is actually not to have that person be treated as an alternative alter and to treat them as a separate person, but to encourage that person to explore options surrounding their gender identity, for example, medical transition, right? And there is a vast amount of data on, for example, the existence of trans people throughout history, noting differently that is not the case with DID. Two-spirit people do exist, but that is more analogous to trans identity than it is to DID. In that there are multiple facets involving a person's gender to their personality, not that you completely black out, lose memory, and then re-engage with a different alter. So inherently, trans people, are worse off in this world. It is well documented that gender affirming care is a very, very successful clinically recommended treatment because it allows that person to become the person who their trauma was suppressing. Okay, also, as Jalila said, trans activists and two-spirit activists are doing tons of great work to normalize these things. The benefit on CG for changing ontologies is a mostly rhetorical ploy that doesn't actually have a significant margin to it. Okay, what I want to explain, though, is the analogy here is to engage with the ontology thing more substantially. Like, it's to basically, if you talk to an obligate wheelchair user, as Pat said, and you tell them that we're accommodating you by providing you different ways of living, that's not actually what this looks like. This looks like telling people who break their legs, for example, especially during childhood, that they need to be wheelchair bound for life and that they cannot or should not have the necessary therapy to be able to heal that break, to be able to go through the painful period of recovery, to access that treatment, to allow insurance companies to fund that treatment because it is the default recommended course of action from doctors. This looks like the default response to that being normalize you being in a wheelchair, and we can try to accommodate you in everyday life because your life is still valid if you are a wheelchair bound individual, if you're an obligate wheelchair user. However, as you can imagine, and Jalila pointed out in her speech, there are many ways that being disabled, I speak from experience here, not on the physical sense, but on the mental side, does actually impair your life. Like, I don't like the fact that I'm terrible at texting my friends back. There are things about disability that are inherent, even if people accommodate me, even if they understand me. It is a yucky feeling in the context of DID, for example, if you are a survivor of sexual violence, which is a common source, again, of people who then develop DID, you have sexual assault trauma. If the baseline clinical response is for a doctor to assume that your alter, who's like if you experience your abuse in childhood, an age regressed individual, right, like a child, to assume that your alter is its own person and, for example, therefore cannot engage in future sexual activity because it is literally a child and it comes out during sexual experiences, that kind of instruction towards you to say this is a part of your personality that is broken off forever, or at least we should presumptively assume that this is its own individual with its own ideas, its own identity. That is a world in which you actually, as an average person who may or may not feel to some extent like intuitively like you have a totally separate break between you and that person, but that is the way that your symptoms are likely to prevent because you have things like memory loss, you have things like dissociation. These are common symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder as well. And so for a doctor, like approaching this, seeing the differential diagnoses, a psychiatrist is going to be in a position to be very hesitant to recommend trying to integrate or even do something as simple as like parts work, which is like talk therapy, trying to integrate different parts of your personality. These types of things are likely to be more, the default is likely to be lumping these things into the like ontological category of having a inherently different identity, despite the fact that it is inherently traumatizing for a lot of people, and they may not want to, for example, be unable to engage, at least to the same extent that they otherwise could, and probably at all, in things like having sex or having a child, because you cannot, for example, get the consent for your body to be forever changed and your responsibilities in life to be forever changed from one of your alters if that alter disagrees because of trauma that may otherwise be, if not fixable, right? We're not expecting things to go 180, mitigable through the type of talk therapy and drug combination that we would get in our world. Okay.
We explained at the bottom of the DPM why respect for these people is actually likely to lead to more better treatment of those people, because if you feel less threatened as this individual, you're far less likely to resist treatment.
Yeah, this is good. I do want to get into this because Daniel also highlighted this. He says, well, first of all, he asserts that we're lying to him about like clinical value of integration. Again, it's not just about integration. It's about any kind of parts therapy. It's about any person experiencing trauma who is then told to at least be skeptical of whether or not it is a good idea to work through the process of going back through those memories, trying to integrate those experiences, right? This is also why we beat opening opposition, by the way. This is not just about people who have DID and like self-diagnosed to evade accountability, which I think is a fringe group of people, but instead about anyone who's experiencing symptoms of trauma, dissociation, memory loss, etc., which exists on a spectrum in medicine. Okay, but to respond to this point about cooperation with clinical professionals, Daniel says, and this is I think what Liam is saying too, people won't trust doctors who pursue integration and that you're likely to not treat that person with care. I think Humam's POI on this is spot on, right? Like doctors are trained to be amenable to like meeting a person where they're at in order to get them to comply with care. Like there's no incentive for doctors to approach this using the most violent method. Also, in their world, it's likely that you're resisting treatment. In our world, you trust a doctor who's a medical expert to at least allow you to rethink, question, and try a different course of treatment, likely to succeed in our world. Proud to.
We did not have consensus call. We had a three-way split. So we use pairwise majority to calculate. The majority call is in the first place closing opposition, in the second place closing government, in the third place opening opposition, and unfortunately in the fourth place opening government. I can clarify each call after the end. I'll start my timer for a 15-minute call. Cool. I think opening government's strongest argument to begin the first comparative, which is OG and OO, is the argument in PM that alters have different memories, they have different preferences and so on, including a different experience of pain and pleasure, and therefore we should have an obligation to treat distinct people as distinct people. This does create a burden to prove that there is some psychological discontinuity, and also to prove that this discontinuity is sufficient for the societal treatment as multiple people distinct as distinct people. How do I credit this? The first half of this burden, because the info slide gives dissociative amnesia, and the DPM does a good job rebuilding this by saying that, as they say, ordinary people may access memories with more or less ease, but people with DID cannot access these memories at all. This is good construction. So OG does prove that DID is meaningfully different from normal personality fluctuation. The second half of the burden is somewhat underproven. I think DLO points out that amnesia is still a very subjective experience from the perspective of external society, and more importantly, that all of these alters still live in the same body with the same organs and the same medication needs and whatnot. I do not very much credit the DLO's ordinary forgetting analogy. I think the threshold of dissociative amnesia in the motion is not quite there. I think I do credit the same body response because it directly clashes with the comparative mechanism that OG needed, which is society has to know how to allocate responsibility and care and obligations and so on. I think the collective punishment on PM is also partially creditable. I think if one alter did not act with volition, then there is a real moral harm in blaming that one alter. The terminal impact is narrower than OG wants. I think DLO answers that responsibility is unavoidable if one body has one medication schedule and a specific set of physical consequences and so on. So the more reasonable impact I will credit for OG is that there is a dignity harm and some unfair blame when alters are flattened together in the same personality, not that the larger version of their argument cleanly avoids the collective punishment. So what does opening opposition comes in the other side of the comparative here with? It's more complete on the burdens. I think LO says that treating alters as separate people makes relationships harder. It makes care worse. The burden, therefore, is to prove the better social and medical outcomes of that. The relationship argument is initially vulnerable. I think DPM says people are more confused when they expect the same memories and preference from someone who has amnesia. That is credited as fair mitigation. I think DLO rebuilds this by saying OO's world still understands that the person has the ID, meaning that people can reasonably expect a fluctuation without conceptualizing different people in one body. This fills the contested burden. I think it explains why the social interaction is more intuitive. It still allows people to understand the disorder. There is a care argument here, which is somewhat clearer, because LO is saying that doctors need continuity of care, and one, what they say, longitudinal, like the relationship, one treatment plan, whatnot. There is a rebuttal by DPM with this, saying that, well, guardianship and the power of attorney, which is partially credited, it proves the opposite of the principle that OG wants to prove, which is if the main decides medication and care for the other alters, then OG is functionally treating the system as one unit when things become more serious. There's a response from DLO here, because when it shows that the separate treatment will fragment the consent, it will fragment some prescriptions, it will anyway, it will always collapse back into one decision maker, which means that OO has a clearer terminal impact, because medical care will have a terminal impact of being worse. There will be worse accountability and more social hesitation and so on. Therefore, there is some margin of OG's surviving impact, but it's smaller because it is contingent on proving that separable personhood and separable responsibility exists. I think OO's impact follows from the shared body and the practical need for continuity. Open opposition is therefore above opening government. Going to the second comparative, there is the so in PM, let's do CG OG. In PM, what they say? That alters have different memories and preferences and whatnot. Therefore, I think the more reasonable impact I will credit from OG in this specific comparative is a bit narrow. So what they prove is that a dignity harm from misrecognition and some unfairness from collective blame arises. The guardianship and power of attorney mitigates somewhat, but the main is given authority over the other alters. This is OG feels the principal burden to some extent. But there is a contested burden of how treating these alters as distinct people improves care. What does CG do? WIP specifically turns the social map and different ontology material into a more functional mechanism here, because member is saying that society needs a map for understanding one body and different minds. Alters have intrinsic value rather than being understood only as a clinical case, which is credit because the ontology spillover is somewhat assertive. There is a but the material that changes the comparative here for me is WIP saying that you need compliance of these other individuals who functionally act like different people. Therefore, this creates a burden to prove that the recognition is necessary for the treatment and the stability, because when alters are told that they are not different people or that people are trying to erase them, they will somewhat become hostile and refuse medication and so on. This feels the missing link in OG because it clears up to me why recognition matters, because it will produce some trust and negotiation among the alters and either stable coexistence or there will be some voluntary integration. This has a clearer terminal impact than the surviving moral harm in OG. It explains what concretely happens in daily life and in care of this person, and therefore CG is above OG, mainly because of that. Let's go to the third comparative, which is CG and OO. So going back to OO, treating alters, says OO, as distinct people will make relationships harder because people don't know which person they're dealing with. DLO's rebuild is matters somewhat more. I think she says that OO can still understand the idea as one person with fluctuating personalities, so people don't have to expect that sameness. So that does feel the contested burden better than DLO alone. Also, the continuity of care claim is well credited. DLO gives the concrete mechanism here, so you have one body and whatnot. Also, the responsibility argument is creditable to a large extent. DLO explains that the shared embodiment is going to create some shared obligations, which is good. But there is a narrower, again, same as with OG, there's a narrower terminal impact in OO than they want, because their model still depends on people with DID and their alters kind of cooperating with a treatment structure that frames them as one individual. What does CG do? The social map, as I said, but again, the explanation of compliance for the WIP, which is the same for the other comparative, right? Because the margin of CG's impact is larger because the lack of cooperation, without which the mechanism of CG doesn't exist, collapses the care continuity OO is kind of relying on. The administrative difficulty on CG may be somewhat mitigated by the recognition producing the negotiation and the coexistence. But on relationships, I think WIP is also giving a very credible response here that the drastic shifts are more confusing when people conceptualize them through the ordinary personality differences, while this at the same time as treating alters as distinct people lets people kind of compartmentalize the relationships. Therefore, CG is above OO. There's a stronger mechanism in CG for the actual care and the day-to-day administration of the condition. Cool. Let's go to CO and OG. Again, there's the dignity harm from misrecognition in OG. What does CO say about that? CO is giving a surviving impact here. What does member says? Member says that well, when you, as I said, as treating alters as entirely distinct people will prevent integration. There is credit to this. CO gives several mechanisms. Firstly, families and friends react with shock if integration is framed as erasing individuals. One alter now can refuse consent and block the treatment for everyone. Institutions become less willing to support treatment at integration if the multiplicity is a valid, settled mode of life. Some of the insurance claims is partially credited. I think it's less substantiated. There is some social stigma. The consent mechanisms are, however, creditable and sufficient. I think CO then proves why integration matters more than OG, because it proves why distinct treatment matters, right? Without integration, people will struggle to study and to work and so on, and remember the coworkers and the clients and the plan of life. Also, they say that some alters are trauma-linked, so separation can, trap particular alters in very painful functions and very incomplete experiences, which is very painful. The more reasonable impact here, I will credit, is not that there will always be a workable integration or requirable integration, but there is an existing and valuable therapeutic pathway, much harder for many people who could benefit from it. So CO is above OG. I think CO proves a clearer mechanism with determinal effects on treatment and work and the study and so on. Even though OG does still get credit for the dignity harm of misrecognition. Now on the opposition bench, I think closing opposition will win here. Member feels the missing burden because OO is not fully proving the positive therapeutic endpoint of that model. I think in particular, the continuity of care claims in OO tells me why treatment is easier to organize, but the terminal impact is unclear. I don't think it's explained enough about what the treatment is trying to achieve beyond stability and some management. CO does that. CO feels that missing burden with integration. Member therefore says the problem with treating alters as very different individuals prevents integration and whatnot, what was said in the previous comparative. Now to finish, CG's strongest material, as I said, is on WIP with the social map and different ontology. But WIP says that alters still have incentives to cooperate because fragmented existence is hard. That is somewhat still assertive. It's applied when it's applied to every alter and every treatment decision. There is some creditable impact in CG here that recognition will improve the chances of compliance and the coexistence, etc. But CO is more concrete. Why? Member in CO says that treating alters as different will have those administrative problems with the mechanisms, as I said, of families and friends. And if individual alter choices should be respected, one alter can change a lot. There's also the insurance claim on CO, which is partially credited. It's less substantiated, to be sure, but the social stigma and the consent mechanisms are filled. So Whip's answer, I think that recognition can enable voluntary integration, does some mitigation. I think treatment probably does require some trust and compliance, but I think it doesn't fully answer CO's central point that treating alters as separate people raises the moral, the social, and even the administrative cost of integration in the first place. So closing opposition should be above closing government, because CO is proving that there is a clearer therapeutic pathway and larger terminal impacts on work and study, and even the processing of the trauma for the specific alters that are bound to trauma, let's say, and the long-term fulfillment, even though CG does get credit for the compliance and the trust mechanism that they talk about recognition. Therefore, this justifies the call of CO, CG, OO, OG, with one panelist call being CO, CG, OG, OO, the other panelist call being CO, OO, CG, OG. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now I think adjudication 2 should.
Yeah, so one panelist had a single player set of people, and the other panelist had a unanimous.
Oh my God.
They were one on everything, we were 2 on 2. Yeah, we were on another. Okay. And the 3, 4.
Yeah.
So like 1.
Yeah. I don't know how Matt.
Yeah, now if Matt is supposed to give his away, but if he's not here, if they're not here. If anyone can reach out to them.
Wait, was Felix watching the OA?
I think Felix was not watching the OA, but was on the other.
Stephen, right. Hello, we're looking for our panel. You guys move your panel.
I should give the call to you at.
Am I supposed to do that in tap questions?
Yes.
Well. Wait, that's exactly what I thought the back half of the evaluated about. In terms of differential, whether or not they would bullshit. Differentials is I know shit all. That's true. And you're a psychiatrist.
Someone remembering my right for practice. I'll get that before I left practice law. My dad wanted me to be a doctor. I would have been unable to get into med school. Yeah, that's true.
Now you're a legal doctor.
Yeah, law school will take any.
Doctor of law.
They'll take any debater. It's true.
Yeah.
That's true. A legal doctor.
Oh.
I'll play someone's coding. I need a doctor. Actually,
Are they still delivering? Is that what's happening?
They need to help them with not being network.
Yeah, exactly. I was gonna say, like, I don't.
It's probably see
breakout
rooms.
Yeah, well, in fact, when you get on the plan,
Which
the
room?
jurisdiction that you.
Oh, yeah, Felix and Matt, they're still.
Which is joining.
That's
Wait,
true.
but like, if they're not.
Apparently they're not.
No, I think they might.
They're still living. Okay.
Wait, like, they're literally talking. You can see them.
You can see them like.
It's nice to be shot.
I think they're still in zero. Like, we can see. Oh, one of them.
Yeah.
Oh, they're
Oh,
here.
Matt's here. Matt's here. Hi, Matt.
Hello. Okay, is everyone ready?
Yes.
Okay, sounds good. Sorry for the delay. So the final call is as follows. Opening government is a pretty clear first. Opening opposition is second. Closing opposition is third. And closing government is fourth. So starting on the top half comparison, there are 4 broad things that come up on the top half. The first question that comes up on the top half is it morally wrong to treat people as the same person? So the main answer we get to this from opening government is when you are experiencing different personalities, you naturally will also have different memories, different emotions, different core values, different preferences. These things are morally significant. So that gives some intuition that these people might be different people. There is a DLO response to this, which basically says, well, there are times where someone's memories might change, or you might lose some of your memories. So for example, consider that you might have Alzheimer's. In those cases, we might consider that the person who has lost their memories might actually be considered the same person. This partially responds to OG, but it doesn't beat the underlying other ideas that OG gives, that, for example, your core values might be fundamentally different, or different emotions or preferences that you have still might fundamentally be different. And those things are also important in determining whether or not we should think that you are a different person. So the OG argument on what it means for someone to be a distinct person gets partial credit. Some of it is mitigated by opening opposition. Next question beneath that is, given that we can, to some extent, consider that these people might deserve different moral consideration, is it morally wrong to treat them as the same individual? The core intuition that opening government gives for this is it's wrong to punish someone for something that they didn't do, which is a very widely shared intuition that the OIV would likely accept, so it's fine enough to credit. There is one implicit response from opening opposition, which basically says, given that opening government concedes that you would use a guardianship model where one core personality makes decisions on behalf of other personalities, doesn't that cut into your own principle? But that isn't really a response, because just because one person has guardianship over other people doesn't mean that you are necessarily treating that second person as invalid or blaming that second person to the same extent. So at that point, I do think that the opening government impact stands. Opening government doesn't necessarily prove that this is a side constraint, but I do think that they prove this argument enough that it is a prima facie consideration that we can give partial credit in the debate. The next clash on the top half is, how does this affect interpersonal relationships for people, and also just the general mental well-being of people who have DID? So there's one argument made in PM, which says that you will feel more dissonance if you are treated as the same person, but that doesn't line up with your experiences, which just means that you might feel worse as an individual. This is never responded to by opening opposition, it's standing. There's also a separate clash beneath this about interpersonal relationships. So the core opening opposition argument is fewer people will enter relationships with you if they expect that you will act in different ways or have entirely different personalities. And then there are kind of two ways that opening opposition impacts this. So the first way that opening opposition impacts this is at the point of entering these relationships, like you might be scared of this person having suddenly switched up personality, so you don't enter it in the first place. This is fine to credit on its own. There's also this second bit, which says you also won't remain in a relationship with the other person if the other person, for example, like switches into another personality. This is more difficult to credit, because even if opening opposition is right and you perceive someone as having multiple different personalities on Gov, they will still change and enter those different personalities either way, and that will still impact the relationship. So this second bit is more difficult to credit because it's not clear why it's comparative. The DPM then responds to this, and most importantly says that even in cases where you would switch into another personality, there are good ways, especially on Gov, that you can prepare for this. So for example, if you recognize that you are different people and you recognize that you might switch into a different personality, you can also identify that, for example, certain emotions might trigger you to switch into another personality, give preemptive warnings that allows you to prime expectations, which mitigates the opening opposition argument on not entering these relationships at all, or these relationships being lower quality. There's also a more flippant and more difficult to credit DPM response that, like, for example, we accept things like polygamy or people having multiple friends, which is not super well explained, but the first response is fine enough. There is then an extra response in DLO, which says, well, you don't know when, for example, a particular personality might come back, which is mitigated by the OG argument that there are steps you can take to prepare for switching into different personalities in the first place. So I don't think that that DLO response fully beats the underlying claim that opening government has made. So at the end of that, OG probably proves at the margin, better preparedness, even if there are personality changes on their side of the house, whereas OO's harms on not entering relationships are partially but not entirely mitigated. The next question is, how does this affect medical care for people who we know have dissociative identity disorder? So opening opposition makes the claim that physicians have a hard time caring for you because, for example, one personality might object to the care that you are providing them. The most important response that OG gives to this implicitly from PM and directly in DPM is, most likely, even when you recognize that these are different people, you will likely have a guardianship style model where you allocate medical decision making, for example, to like one particular personality, which beats the OO response. Because if you allocate decision making to one personality, then it doesn't matter, as OO says, that one particular personality might agree with care. So that opening opposition argument is beaten on the top half. But more importantly, there's also additional analysis added in DPM, which points out why, if you are trying to provide someone with care but you are only treating them as having one personality, that might actually be more of a reason that they resist treatment. Whereas on the alternative, on Gov's side of the house, when you recognize that you have different personalities, when, for example, providing them care, even if one particular personality has decision-making power, it actually might be easier to, for example, get them to cooperate with things like therapy. So OG pretty conclusively wins the clash on providing people with DID care. And then there's this final question that comes up on the top half of like, does DID exist to the info slide to the extent that the info slide suggests it does, and what are the harms of people kind of taking advantage of this kind of vague disorder under either conception? So I think that OG is probably right to say that even if to some extent DID isn't fully medically understood, there's still certain concrete symptoms we can look at, like sudden amnesia, which give us reasonable enough idea of whether or not someone has DID in the first place. And more importantly, even if opening opposition is right and this condition isn't fully understood, whether or not that's bad is kind of under impacted from opening opposition. So there isn't refrain throughout opening opposition that it might be harder to hold people accountable, but opening opposition doesn't spend too much time actually explaining why that is a good thing. So even if opening opposition is right, and this is blurry, it's not clear that that's a harm, independent of the responses that OG also gives for why, for example, no one would ever like pretend to have DID because of stigma surrounding it. So at the end of all of that, the OG wins the interpersonal clash for the reasons that I've already explained. And more importantly, OG also has separate standing benefits on things like feeling less dissonant or being able to treat people who have DID far more easily. Meanwhile, the only other standing OO benefit is it's harder to hold people accountable. But as I've already pointed out, OO doesn't spend that much time explaining why that matters, whereas OG's principle actually explains why it's morally wrong to hold people accountable. So even if the OO impact is true, OG still beats it by pointing out that, you know, that impact is actually a bad thing. So that's why opening government beats opening opposition. Sorry, that was very in the weeds because there were lots of individual mechanisms to go through. But yeah, CG. So CG starts by providing context that people who have DID might wind up in different difficult situations. So for example, you're driving, you experience stress, suddenly like you're experiencing different personality, you have amnesia. That's really, really scary. This is fine enough to credit. But the more important bit from CG often, yep.
Sorry.
Oh, wait,
Okay.
did someone say something?
We're just plugging the computer in. You're good now, though.
So the more important bit from CG is here are a range of ways under our conception of DID that social norms might change positively. So the issue we ultimately had with placing CG in the round is that when you look at a lot of these individual mechanisms, a lot of them have inherent missing burdens that make them very difficult to credit. So I'll go through the four core ones. The first one is, you know, people might accept you more. So for example, parents might accept that they have 3 or 4 different kids, which does seem like the opening government argument on social acceptance with the extra example added of parents, but it's not actually adding new contestable analysis. There is a second better argument that says that, for example, you may be more likely to provide disability support to people who have DID, and that disability support might be better when you'd otherwise face discrimination in the labor market. So we give this some partial credit, but the issue with fully crediting this particular mechanism is that even if you recognize someone who has DID as different people, why does that necessarily mean that you will implement protections for these people in the labor market? Like there's kind of an intuitive jump from this conception generally exists to these protections will be enshrined, especially when, as other teams characterize, this is a like rare and also very heavily stigmatized condition. So it may be possible that you implement these protections, but it's not proven from CG that it's likely that you implement these protections. So that mechanism gets partial credit. Next, there are also lines both in MG and in the WHIP about treatment. So for example, that treatment might be better and you might have a greater incentive to cooperate when you know that you are being treated as different people, which unfortunately is derivative of the end of DPM. There are also separate impacts of self-harm, which unfortunately are not contestable. So they're not advancing the persuasiveness of the bench. And then finally, there is another argument from CG, which basically just says, when you have this conception of DID, that may also cause you to treat trans people or two-spirit people better, get them more support when you, for example, recognize them as different people, recognize their identities as valid. Again, maybe this gets some partial credit, but it also seems like this individual mechanism has several missing steps. So for example, why does your conception of DID specifically then map on to how you are treating trans people or two-spirit people? And more importantly, as op-whip, for example, later flags, why is the type of support that you would be giving these people good? So comparing CG firstly to OG. So charitably to CG, maybe they prove partially that you, for example, provide people with DID greater disability support at the margin, or maybe you provide trans or two-spirit people with greater support than you would otherwise. OG has a separate argument, which is we get more medical support for people who have DID, less dissonance. The main reason that on this clash of like state/medical support, OG wins is because these impacts seem similarly important, but there are fewer steps required for the opening government version of the argument to work because it's directly connected to people who have DID, whereas there are more steps required for the CG version of the argument to work for the burdens that I just pointed out. And more importantly, even if these impacts are entirely equal and both GovBench teams have similarly strong arguments on support, OG also has separate claims. So for example, the prima facie moral argument that I still have to give partial credit, which probably means that the cumulative impact that OG has is still larger than the impact that CG has, even if CG kind of better proves their arguments on disability support, for example. Moving on to the short diagonal. So firstly, there's a clash that comes up on the short diagonal on medical care. So the first thing to point out is that even though there are some responses in GovWhip to the opening opposition argument on medical care, they're kind of difficult to credit because I can't double credit CG with this argument if OG already made the core argument. Whereas opening opposition does have the separate standing mechanism on improving medical care. So one person might veto the medical care that you have given them. That's bad because you can't provide people with medical care in the first place. There is an extra response from CG to the op bench, which basically just says it's not clear why care is good. I'm not sure how much credit I can give this because it does seem intuitive for the illustrations from both op teams that care can at least help to some extent. So for example, you provide people with things like talk therapy to ensure that they can better navigate like their condition. So I think that that individual response from CG probably needed to be more thoroughly explained because it does seem intuitive enough to the OIV that care in these particular cases could be good. And more importantly, even though OG beats the OO version of the medical care argument with the stuff on guardianship, CG does not make any separate argument about like social norms or guardianship. So I can't double credit CG with the OG mechanism on guardianship. So that's why the OO argument on medical care beats CG, but it doesn't beat OG. And then more importantly, OO also has separate lines on, for example, entering fewer relationships with people who have DID. There are extra responses to this from CG, which say things along the lines of, you can recognize that you have different relationships with different people. But again, this is a response that is unfortunately already given in the DPM. So again, I can't credit CG with that response. So OO's argument on entering fewer relationships with people is still very much standing. So at the end of all of that, for similar reasons that OG beats CG, OO also beats CG. Bringing in closing opposition, who's a very difficult team to place in the debate. So the core idea from closing opposition is firstly that integration matters. So especially toward the second half of the MO and then certain portions of the op whip, there are a lot of illustrations of why it could help to integrate people and a lot of impacting about how, for example, your bosses might be frustrated with you if they don't appropriately understand your decision, or you are making big life decisions and you need people to understand that you might switch into different personalities. All of that impacting is good, but ultimately it is contingent on the first extension, which is, do you actually get better treatment for people with DID? And more importantly, it's not necessarily clear that integration being good or bad is a contentious mechanism because both GovBench teams agree that integration can be a good thing, and they're giving arguments about why it's good to provide people with treatment. So since GovBench agrees that integration can be a good thing, it's not really advancing the persuasiveness of the bench to give reasons that integration is good, because if the other side agrees, then like your side is not any better off for proving that integration can be good. So more importantly from CO, we have this argument which just says we get better medical treatment for people who have DID. And there are three crucial reasons that CO gives for why you have better treatment. So the first one is, on Gov, if you recognize people as having multiple personalities, but you still try to treat them, you might be seen as erasing someone. This is fine enough to credit. Unfortunately, we don't credit the second and the third reasons. So the second reason is the same reason that opening opposition has already given, which is one personality might object to treatment, which makes treatment harder. And then the third reason that closing opposition gives is insurance companies also might be less likely to provide support to people with DID because, for example, you just have the perception that all of these different personalities are kind of having fine enough lives. I think this mechanism is slightly too flippant because there is kind of a jump between recognizing that people have different personalities and thinking they're fine enough such that you don't need to insure them, for example. So it was kind of difficult to give this third mechanism much credit. So at the end of all of that, CO on their own partially proves a different way that they might get better treatment for people with DID on their side of the house, although it isn't the strongest mechanism because it's a more like indirect mechanism about social perceptions. So moving into the op bench, so firstly, both OO and CO give mechanisms about why treatment might be important. I think at the margin, I would probably tip the needle in favor of opening opposition because the opening opposition argument is about directly on Gov's side, one personality might object, that directly makes treatment harder. Whereas the CO mechanism on it is seen that you are erasing certain personalities then depends on the extra assumption that the type of treatment you give people on Gov intends to erase different personalities, which is not necessarily true. So because the CO mechanism requires an extra step, I do think that the OO mechanism on treatment being better is actually stronger than the CO mechanism. And more than that, opening opposition also has several other harms that are kind of standing. So for example, harms on people entering fewer relationships with you. So even if the impacts on the op bench on medical treatment are perfectly even, OO also has separate benefits, which I think cumulatively outweigh the CO benefits. Moving on to the long diagonal. So firstly, on the long diagonal, there's the question of quality of care. So I already pointed out what CO's main standing mechanism is. The first thing that I would note is I do think that the OG argument on guardianship, which is not responded to by CO, implicitly responds to this CO mechanism. So like, it's not clear that you would be seen as erasing people if, again, you are still recognizing that multiple different personalities have moral worth, but just for practical reasons are giving one particular personality control over particular medical conditions. Like, I agree that the CO mechanism could still partially work, but it's slightly mitigated by OG. And then more importantly, OG also has this separate standing argument about resisting treatment that isn't properly responded to by closing opposition. So I think the opening government mechanism is more standing, whereas the closing opposition mechanism for getting people better treatment is partially mitigated. So OG wins on the treatment clash. But then more importantly, OG has a lot of other arguments about how, you have better interpersonal relationships or about how these people deserve moral consideration, which also might outweigh closing opposition altogether. And then finally, the back half, which was extremely close, basically firstly comes down to the quality of care clash. Like I mentioned before, since we're not crediting CG too much with some of the responses that they give to CO about why quality of care might be worse, or we thought that some of the CG responses, so for example, why is treatment good, were underexplained, it was more difficult to credit CG with offense on improving the quality of care that people have on their side of the house, whereas CO does have that one standing mechanism on the quality of care might be worse at the margin, which then allows them to access their impacting about integration actually being a good thing. There is also a really strong response in op-whip to the CG argument on trans people, which just points out that even if, for example, you treat trans people as entirely different people, that could also actually be a bad thing. So alternatively, on their side of the house, you might actually get a push for gender affirming care. I don't credit this to the greatest extent because, again, it still depends on the link that your conception of DID will map onto how you treat trans people. But there is an intuitive enough link established at the beginning of OpWhip that basically just points out that in some cases, people falsely thought that trans people had DID. So I think it partially works for closing opposition, but could have used a bit more explanation. So I think that also flips the other CG argument. So at the end of that, CO has offense both on maybe you help trans people a bit more at the margin, and also more importantly, you get more medical care for people. CG has the argument of maybe at the margin, you get more disability support. And for the reasons I've already mentioned about why direct medical support for people with DID probably outweighs the CG argument on like the state will then implement protections that, for example, are related to disabilities. CG outweighs, or CO outweighs CG. Sorry, that was very messy, but let me